Broadcasting from Detroit's Cass Corridor, it's the Metro on WDET. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Robin Vincent. Today on the show, when rain clouds gather, anxiety rises in Dearborn Heights, Taylor, and beyond.
We'll hear from an advocate working to break the cycle of stormwater flooding in Metro Detroit.
Plus, Caitlin Clark brought fresh eyes and excitement to women's basketball. Can that momentum close the gender gap?
We'll get answers from Christine Brennan in her new book, On Her Game, about the evolution of women's sports.
And we'll look at that evolution when it comes to local women's soccer.
Detroit City Football Club's Ella Carroll Act talks about true representation on and off the pitch.
But first, in a nation where supermarkets are filled from floor to ceiling, a single missed phone call can empty a family's pantry and leave children going to bed hungry. Investigative journalist and author Tracy McMillan knows this firsthand, both from her own experience with SNAP benefits or food stamps and her years reporting on America's working poor. Her new opinion piece in the New York Times introduces us to a mother from Metro Detroit struggling to make ends meet. Adding to that struggle is her daily battle navigating a complex system to get food assistance. It has her constantly worrying about her next meal. As lawmakers debate slashing nearly $300 billion from food assistance, millions of Americans are facing an uncertain future. Tracy McMillan joins us now to discuss what this moment means for families in Metro Detroit and why hunger remains a persistent reality in America today. Tracy, welcome to the Metro.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
So before we get into the Trump administration's proposed cuts to federal food assistance, I want to discuss what it's like to rely on these benefits. In your piece for the New York Times, we meet Jocelyn Walker. She's a mother and entrepreneur in Metro Detroit who's navigating an exhausting bureaucracy just to feed herself and her child. Could you briefly tell us about Jocelyn, about those single missed calls, and why her experience speaks so powerfully to the larger story of hunger in America?
Yeah, of course. So Jocelyn is a youngish single mom, like early 30s, has an 8-year-old son who's got autism. And so, she had bounced around through a bunch of low-wage jobs, making $10, $12, $14 an hour. None of these jobs would actually give her full-time hours, right? Because then they'd have to pay, I presume, they have to pay for health insurance, right?
Sure.
So she's barely getting sort of stuff paid for, and she figures out that she could start a business doing hair, right? So she goes, during the pandemic, she goes to cosmetology school. When she gets out, right, being an entrepreneur is really hard. And so after she pays her business expenses, she's really taking home about $800 every month. And so that entitles her to some food assistance from the state. Entrepreneurship's a really good fit for her as the parent of an autistic child, right? Because if she has to take off and take care of him, like, it's not a big deal. But we were talking about this, and I was talking to her about, like, well, what's the process like? And she starts explaining to me that 2 years ago, excuse me, she was calling in and she was 162nd in line, right? When she called at like 9:30 in the morning, right? And she was calling because all of a sudden her case was closed and she didn't know why. And so her food stamps were gone, her Medicaid was gone. And she was 162nd in line, right? So she does the thing where you say, okay, give me a call back. They call her back at 4 p.m. and she's doing like a silk press or something, right? She's in the middle of something. She doesn't get the call. It takes her a few more days to get someone online, and it takes 2 months before she can get that money back.
So she's spending hours each week making phone calls, chasing paperwork, and worrying about the status of her food assistance. Now, Tracy, you've reported extensively on SNAP. That's the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and you've lived this experience yourself. How widespread are these kinds of bureaucratic breakdowns, and what do they reveal about the way SNAP is designed?
Right. So over the last couple of decades, public assistance benefits of various kinds, right, have become more and more punitive and bureaucratic than they were in the past. Usually legislators and politicians are using language around dependency and self-sufficiency and saying we need to prove that these people are truly needy, right? And the fact is that there's very little fraud in terms of stealing benefits by people who don't deserve it. When we talk about dependency, 80% of households that are on SNAP already have somebody who is working in the home within the last year, right? People going and taking SNAP when they're not working isn't really a problem. The problem is that they're not earning enough wages to make up for the cost of groceries, right? But this paperwork thing, right? You know, I came into this work as somebody who did reporting in New York City under Mayor Giuliani and the evolution of welfare reform there. And they explicitly made cash assistance and food stamps hard to get and to keep. They called it diversion because they said very overtly, we want to make it hard for you to use this so you don't really get it unless you really, really, really want to put up with all this crap, right? And I think for folks who are maybe not used to dealing with public systems and that bureaucracy, a good example of what it might be like is how you deal with your health insurance. So if you think about all the paperwork you have to go through dealing with your health insurance, if your food is tied to that sort of thing, right? And that's what the system that we're sort of seeing take hold.
So we're talking about a very complex web to navigate that is full of headaches, but then this additional stress because we're talking about something as imperative as food, as nutrition, as feeding yourself. What is the impact of SNAP right now? How many people are assisted by it, and what kinds of benefits does it give them?
Yeah, so in Michigan, about 1.3 million folks are using SNAP right now. The average size of a benefit for folks is $5.96 a day per person, right? So this is not huge amounts of money. It's often, you know, a grocery bill that's going to be under $100 a week for a family. So this is not a lot of help, but it's really important for the folks who are depending on it, right?
I want to go back to what we're hearing from critics. Right now, Republicans want to take away Medicaid and food stamps. And one of the things that they say for people who are recipients of these types of benefits is that when we make government goods too available, that people will cheat the system, that inevitably people who shouldn't have gotten food stamps or Medicaid or any other government program take it when they shouldn't, and that's unfair. What do you say to the people who believe that the system is unfair as it stands because there are people who benefit from it when they shouldn't?
I mean, I can see folks being worried about that, but the dollar amount is not very big, right? This is not a huge part of our spending. And I want to point out, right, we're making these cuts in order to make permanent tax cuts that are helping the wealthiest folks, right? So, you know, one of the statistics is that like these tax cuts that these kinds of cuts will pay for are things like giving households that earn $4.3 million a year an extra $390,000 in the first year, right? So, you know, if we're actually interested in sort of responsible budgeting and all of that, I think maybe the more important question is to talk about what do we think the wealthiest folks are obligated to do and take care of, like because of their sort of participation in the system, right? So at the low end, fraud by recipients is not a significant problem. There is fraud, but it's usually sort of outside of the realm of an individual person cheating the system. And, you know, those people need food in order to participate in the economy, in order for kids to grow up. And I think we all benefit, right, from not having people that are unable to eat.
This conversation right now is reminding us that SNAP benefits appear to be a partisan issue, but there are beneficiaries of SNAP living in both the Democratic and Republican areas. I'm thinking about rural households as much as urban ones.
Yeah. So, I mean, the majority of counties that get SNAP are actually rural, right? So this is a widespread thing, right? Poverty in rural communities, certainly Michigan and other places, that is a problem. I did talk to a rural family when I was reporting the piece as well. You know, and an important thing to understand is not only are these work requirements, which is the focus of the piece in the Times, right, that are going to hit folks like Jocelyn and force her to prove every month that she is working enough hours, right? So you overlay that health insurance bureaucracy into proving that you worked enough, right? In sort of rural areas, right, there's often not really that much employment. And both the Senate and House bills are going to take away an exemption for work requirements that was applied in places where there just weren't enough jobs, right? So rural areas where people haven't had to prove this stuff as much are going to be now required to do it. So you're going to, I talked to this household in northern Michigan where it was a married mom with 4 kids, 2 sons with like mental health issues who lived at home, grown, 2 younger kids. And her husband's disabled and she's recovering from surgery and has her own disability. She's in the process of getting approved for disability and she would be subject to work requirements, right? So this woman all of a sudden is going to have to prove, every month that she worked 80 hours or that she can't work 80 hours, or mostly what happens with work requirements is you just get kicked off because you can't keep up with the paperwork.
So these are the voices and the conversations that you feel like are getting lost when people are using that argument about work requirements.
Work requirements and dependency, right? Like we hear this sort of language around welfare cheats and dependency, which is calling up this really shameful history that starts with Ronald Reagan, really sort of playing up this idea of black welfare queens taking stuff that they don't deserve, right? And that's got a long, deep and shameful history. And then what happens is you sort of tweak it and you say, we're not actually upset about race. We're upset about the dependency. And then it broadens the derision to all poor people.
This is the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent. We're talking about potential cuts to federal food assistance and what it could mean for Metro Detroit families. Our guest is investigative journalist and author Tracy McMillan. Tracy, your work underscores how SNAP functions as really a lifeline for working people whose wages don't cover basic living costs. We've been talking about that. Here in Metro Detroit, jobs are seemingly plentiful, yet many people still rely heavily on food assistance. Why isn't work enough to protect families from food insecurity? Something you mentioned is stagnant wages, and I realize you point to that as well in your essay.
Yeah, so I think Jocelyn Walker did a beautiful job of talking about this in the piece, right? The woman I talked to on Snap, just sort of saying, the expenses are more than the wages, right? The federal minimum wage, if it had kept pace with inflation and productivity since the 60s, right, would be around $25 an hour, right? That is not what the federal minimum wage is. That's not what Michigan's minimum wage is, right? Folks cannot actually afford the cost of living. If you look at the living wage calculator from MIT, a Metro Detroit resident who's a single parent of 1 child needs to be earning around $77,000 a year.
When I read that in your piece, it really just stopped me in my tracks. I think about the folks living in the city of Detroit, for example, and what their incomes are sitting at. And for a lot of people, they're sitting at incomes less than $40,000 per year. It just sounds like that number, $70,000, when you have 1 child to make ends meet,
right?
It's really high.
So, running your hair business, right, to start is not going to get you that kind of income. But neither is working in a store. Right? You're not going to be getting that. And honestly, neither is writing.
That's right. Have you seen examples, Tracy, where increasing wages has demonstrably decreased reliance on programs like SNAP?
I've certainly seen that in my reporting, right, where people get a better job and then they don't need the benefits as much. But interestingly, right, in 2016, the Economic Policy Institute did a study looking at what happened if you raised wages, what happened to public benefits. And this is a much more effective way to reduce use of public benefits than work requirements, right? So the work requirements that are being proposed would save around $92 billion over 10 years. Raising the minimum wage, this is in 2016, but raising the minimum wage up by like $4 or $5 at that time would have saved, I think it was $17 billion a year. Right, in public benefits, right? So if you actually really care about ending quote unquote dependency, what you would do is you would make sure people could earn enough money at their jobs to support themselves, right? There's all this talk from the current administration about the transformative power of work, but I think everybody actually knows that it's not the work that is transformative, it's getting paid enough to live that transforms your life, right? And being able to have agency and self-reliance in that way. But you got to make enough money.
Let's talk about another aspect of what it means to get paid enough to live or not. Both Jocelyn Walker, the woman you profile in your essay, and you describe the intense psychological toll that navigating the SNAP system exacts. Constant uncertainty about food access affects more than just diet, right? It affects mental health, stability, and hope. How do you see these psychological burdens playing out for families across Metro Detroit?
Well, I think it just makes everything so much more difficult, and it takes up a lot of headspace. The more that I talked to Jocelyn, the clearer it was to me, right, that she's just got this constant, steady anxiety about, well, I got to make sure I'm on top of my benefits. I got to make sure I'm on top of my benefits. I got to call in and make sure that paperwork got processed. And I see this in myself. Right now, I don't use SNAP, right, but my healthcare, right, like making sure that I call and I'm on top of that, right? And there's this cognitive load that we're expecting anybody who's not wealthy enough, to not need any kind of like insurance or SNAP or anything, right? We expect everybody to sort of spend all their time making sure that they've proved that they deserve something instead of just making a system that works. And it's also important to understand, we talk about these work requirements saving money because they reduce benefits. That's arguable. It also costs a lot of money to run that kind of bureaucracy, right? And there are corporations at their profit center. It's just running the bureaucracy, right? So like the more paperwork there is to get through, the more money that they make. So there's in fact a sort of built-in incentive to have the system not work very well because these companies get paid for people cycling on and off and constantly having to loop through paperwork.
Gosh, when I think about all the time that a person might be dedicating to managing those benefits and then dealing with that bureaucratic system of the people who are supposed to be helping them to manage it, it feels like that time could be better spent securing higher paying work, a better job, for example, doing things that could really contribute to your life.
Right. Or even just working, right? I mean, for me, somebody like me, and actually Jocelyn, right, because we're both self-employed, any hour that we have to spend on the phone arguing about bureaucracy is an hour we can't spend doing our work, right, or taking care of family or whatever else that we need to do. So, I mean, I think, this work requirement stuff is just going to have such a broad effect of generating all this anxiety and taking away productivity from folks where they have to worry about that instead of taking care of themselves, getting to work, and all the things that build like a strong community.
Tracy, here on the Metro, our coverage frequently focuses on Detroit itself, where poverty rates are 2.5 times the state average. But as your reporting has shown us, hunger and economic insecurity affect the entire metro area. So beyond Detroit city limits, what are some other, would you say, overlooked challenges facing families that policymakers and the broader public are often failing to recognize?
Well, certainly, I think access to good and healthy food in places is something we tend to overlook. We tend to just sort of say, oh, well, there'll be grocery stores or whatever. And increasingly, like Dollar General is a primary grocer for folks.
Yeah.
So I think that's a real issue. And we don't talk enough about wages, right? There's not enough work that pays sufficiently to support a family. That's just sort of full stop. That is a problem, and we don't talk about that. I have family that lives in rural parts of the state, and, you can go and work at a cafe, and that'll be $10, $12, maybe $15 an hour, right? But you can't start a family on that.
I want to close things out by acknowledging how insightfully you've written about stereotypes, particularly racial stereotypes, and how they shape narratives around welfare and dependency. And historically, conversations about food stamps have been loaded with racial undertones, despite the reality of SNAP recipients being highly diverse. How do these harmful biases influence public opinion and ultimately policy decisions around food assistance?
Yeah, well, in the U.S., we have a really long history of covering poverty and hardship as if it is normal for Black folks and unusual for white folks. And what that has done is it has sort of normalized it. It's sort of made particularly white Americans, I think, kind of numb to the idea of suffering among other communities. And so you sort of create this idea that like poverty is normal, and for Black folks who might be cheating the system, and if you're a white person, you're poor, you need to get help and you deserve it. And, Martin Gillens did some wonderful work in the 90s on sort of this conflation where you would see journalists actually covering, again, Black poverty and hardship as dysfunction and white poverty and hardship as something that was not their fault, right? And only when it was really sympathetic story, right, and not a more complicated one. And I think it's just so important to remember, right, while, it's true, Black folks are about a quarter of the folks on SNAP, white folks are 40% of the people on SNAP, right? And so when we're talking about this program, it's much more diverse than folks understand. And it includes a lot of folks, not just folks who are unemployed or working in the service sector, but it includes a lot of folks who do creative work, includes a lot of entrepreneurs, and a lot of what we appreciate, I think, in a broad and diverse city and community and state does rely on that. It's just folks are quiet about it.
Investigative journalist and author Tracy McMillan, her new essay in the New York Times is titled, "I Got $4 a Week in Food Stamps. This is the Reality of Hunger in America." Her second book is The White Bonus, 5 Families and the Cash Value of Racism in America. Tracy, thanks very much for joining us on the Metro.
Thank you so much for having me, Robin.
From the WDET newsroom, an extreme heat warning is in effect for Genesee, Macomb, Oakland, and Wayne counties until 8 p.m. Tuesday. Heat index values will exceed 100 degrees. Find air-conditioned spaces to cool down, drink plenty of fluids, and take action if you or someone you know shows signs of heat exhaustion or heat stroke. You can go to WDET.org/cool for a comprehensive list of cooling centers throughout Metro Detroit. Up next, are added security measures at Detroit transit centers making them less accessible for people seeking shelter from extreme weather? It's been a topic of conversation at Detroit City Council meetings as of late. We'll get the report from the Detroit Documenters next. You're listening to The Metro on WDET. Stay with us.